Hey there, welcome back to another episode of Mixcraft Quick Tips, the series where we take a look at helpful tips inside of Mixcraft to improve your workflow and your productions. For more quick tips, be sure to subscribe to the channel down below, and if you have a suggestion for a future episode, let us know down in the comments. Today, we're here to talk about creating a podcast using Mixcraft. Podcasting has really taken off in the last couple of years, and it's a lot of fun to create your own podcast to talk about your music production, or another topic you're interested in that's completely outside of music, and Mixcraft makes it really easy to get started. In this video, we're going to talk about everything you need to know to get started creating your podcast inside of Mixcraft. We're going to be talking about microphone techniques, setting up for recording, how to edit the audio to make it sound professional, and a bunch of other pro tips to make your podcast stand out. First up, let's talk about microphones when it comes to podcasting. When it comes to broadcast production, most people prefer to use dynamic microphones like the Shure SM7B, the Electro Voice RE2020, or even the humble but very useful Shure SM58. Dynamic mics are a great choice for podcasting and broadcast production because they're cheap and easy to get a hold of, they're very durable, offer high quality sound, and don't require phantom power to use, so you can hook it up with just about any interface or mixer to get started using them. Another popular choice is a large diaphragm condenser microphone like the one I'm using right here, which is an AKG C214. These microphones offer a really crisp and detailed response. They tend to pick up quieter signals better, but the downside is they do require phantom power to use, so your interface or mixer would have to supply phantom power, or you would need to pick up another power supply in order to use one. To compare a large diaphragm condenser with a standard dynamic microphone, I've recorded a quick test using the AKG C214 here and my Shure SM58. Let's take a listen. This is an example recording using a large diaphragm microphone for a podcast recording setup. This is an example recording using a dynamic microphone for a podcast recording setup. This is an example recording using a large diaphragm microphone for a podcast recording setup. This is an example recording using a dynamic microphone for a podcast recording setup. When it comes to how you mic up your host and your guests, there are a few easy tricks to keep in mind to get the best results. First up is making sure you've gain staged properly. If you haven't seen our video about gain staging, you can check that out and then come back to this video. This is really important to ensure you've got the best signal to noise ratio and audio quality for your podcast. Next up is miking with an off-axis setup, as I'm doing right here. As you can see, the microphone is slightly away from me, and this provides a really natural feel to dialogue recording and is also great to reduce plosives like puh or buh, and also reduces excessive sibilance or the s sound, which can get really brittle and annoying. Next up, make sure you've got a pop filter, which is one of these little mesh things I've got set up here. This helps reduce plosives or any excessive air from hitting the microphone capsule and causing that large bassy distortion. All you need to do to set this up is hook it up to your microphone stand and place it about 1 to 2 inches away from the microphone capsule. The next tip is taking advantage of the proximity effect and close miking. If we have this microphone too far away, we're going to get a lot of extra room echo and annoying flutter and just general room tone, and we don't really want that. We want a nice clear recording, so miking about 8 to 10 inches away from your subject is usually a safe bet. Another thing that close miking allows is for you to take advantage of the proximity effect. If you don't know about the proximity effect, what this is when we have a cardioid capsule microphone, meaning a microphone that picks up sound from only one direction. If we get closer to that microphone, we'll get kind of a natural bass boost, which can give you that more classic radio host sound. To demonstrate this quickly, I'm speaking right now off-axis from the microphone at about 10 inches away, and if I get closer to the microphone like this, it's going to have a much more big, bassy radio DJ sound to it. Finally, the last big tip is to make sure you're recording in a good acoustic environment. In this room here, we've got carpet on the floors, which acts as a great natural acoustic absorber. I've got a couch over here, which naturally soaks up some extra sound, and then I've got these big acoustic panels all around the room. This way, we're not getting any annoying room echo and other things that can make the podcast sound a little bit amateur. Now that we've got everything set up, we can hop into Mixcraft and start recording our episode and talk about editing. Now that we've recorded our podcast, we're ready to sit down and edit the episode, and there's a fair amount of editing involved to get your raw recordings to a completed episode, but luckily Mixcraft offers everything we need to make this happen. The first thing we need to do is edit the actual audio by removing anything we don't need, like awkward long pauses, any excessive ums or uhs, or other parts that just need to be redone and we had to do another take of. In order to make your editing life a bit easier, you can hit the tilde key on your keyboard and that will unlock the audio from the grid, and this way you can edit things in a bit more of a natural and conversational way rather than being locked to a musical grid value for your edits. Now that we've got this set up, let's take a listen through this little example recording. Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Mixcraft podcast. And today we are going to be talking about recording, editing, and creating a podcast using only Mixcraft and the built-in tools. Let's get started. So there's a few quick things we need to do. We'll trim off the excess silence at the start and the end here. And then we'll go in and remove this little pause in the middle, which is pretty easy to do. We'll just highlight around it, hit the delete key to remove it, and then we'll move our audio to align it to where it sounds a bit more natural without that pause in the middle. Episode of the Mixcraft podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about recording, editing, and there you go, we're done. Now that we've edited our episode, we'll want to add some basic processing to the voiceover as they probably don't sound broadcast ready right away. To edit this audio, we only need a handful of tools. We'll use some EQ, compression, de-essing, a limiter, and a noise gate. To kick things off, we'll grab a noise gate, so we'll go over to our effects and search for gate and bring up the TB gate, and we'll adjust the threshold value here until it starts to close off whenever there's silence. What we're looking for is to trim off only the silence and not affect the actual voice. So if we set this to something too high here, and we play this track, hello and welcome to the first episode. You'll hear that it's chopping up the voice, which we don't want. So we'll start backing this off. Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Mixcraft podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about recording. We can see it's only affecting the silences and not the actual voice. Next, we'll go over and search for an EQ and grab the TB parametric equalizer. To start things off, we'll go to band 1 here, and we'll set this to a low cut, and this way we can cut off any low rumbling frequencies, usually below about 100 hertz. And we'll give that a shot. Hello and welcome to the first episode. Now, we'll start increasing this until it starts to lose body, and then we'll back off a bit. Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Mixcraft podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about recording, editing, and creating. And right about there should be good. Next up, we'll go up to band 6 here and increase this by a couple of dB to add some high-end detail. Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Mixcraft podcast. Today, we don't want to add too much because we don't want it to be overly bright, but this sounds good. Next up, we'll use these remaining bands to remove any resonances. We can increase this and increase the Q factor to be relatively narrow, and we're going to sweep through the audio and find any frequencies that stand out in kind of a harsh or unpleasant way. Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Mixcraft podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about recording, editing, and creating a podcast using only Mixcraft and the built-in tools. Let's get started. And then we can maybe add just a little bit of a low-end boost here. Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Mixcraft podcast. Today we are going, and that sounds pretty solid to me. Now that we've got our EQ done, we can bring in a compressor. We'll find the TB compressor and we'll set this up to have a ratio of 2:1. We'll disable the automatic release here. We'll set this to maybe 150 milliseconds and set the attack to maybe 5 milliseconds. Now that we've got our compressor set up, we can start using the threshold here to adjust the amount of compression. We'll go for about -5 here on this meter, and that should sound nice and natural while just giving it a bit more of a presence and fullness to the overall sound. Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Mixcraft podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about recording, editing, and creating. Right about there seems to be pretty good. The last important step is de-essing, and this is a special type of compressor that targets the or sibilant frequencies, and we're going to use this to reduce any excessive sibilance in the recording where we're saying things that have an S or other bright frequencies. We can go in here and just search for the de-esser, and we'll find the TB de-esser here, and this should work at the default settings, but you can adjust the amount with the amount knob here. Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Mixcraft podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about recording, editing, and creating a podcast using only Mixcraft and the built-in tools. Let's get started. And the overall goal here that you always want to keep in mind is that you want the speech to sound natural. If you do too many edits or make your edits too complex, it can be really obvious that there's a lot of processing going on, which can just sound a little bit strange. Now that we've got our main dialogue edited, we can add any post-production effects like intro and outro music, background music, sound effects, or whatever else you feel like adding into your episodes. If you don't have any sound effects handy, one great tip to know about is the Mixcraft library here, and we can go to this internet icon to search the freesound.org library for public domain sounds and add in any sound effects. For instance, if we had someone calling into the show, we could search for a phone ringing effect. Once we've found an effect we like, we could go in and add a new audio track and drag in our phone sound effect and line that up with where it would make sense. Let's say someone called in here, we could blend this in, drop the volume a bit. Let's get started. And now we've got our sound effect added in. As long as you search for the public domain license, all of these sounds are free to use in your podcast productions. Once we have our final episode ready, we just need to add a limiter to the master track to make sure it's broadcast ready for all the different platforms you'll be submitting your podcast to. To add the master limiter, we'll go into the effects here and search for the TB barricade, and we're going to set up the output ceiling by double-clicking and setting this to -1 dB, which is the typical broadcast standard. The rest of these settings shouldn't be necessary to adjust, but the only thing you'll need to know about is adjusting your input gain here. So right now, if we take a look at the meter, hello and welcome to the first we can see that this is maybe a bit quiet and we're not quite reaching a normal broadcast level. So we can start increasing this until it sounds a bit more volume friendly for different platforms. Hello and welcome to the first episode of the Mixcraft podcast. And that should be pretty solid. We don't need to slam this all the way up to where it's getting limited constantly. We just want to increase the volume a bit to where it sounds a bit more natural and like an acceptable volume you would normally listen at. Once we've got our episode edited and mastered, we can go up to File and Mix Down To, and then export an MP3 of our podcast to distribute on different platforms. Finally, as one last added bonus tip, one cool thing you can also do with Mixcraft is export a video format of your podcast to distribute on YouTube and other video streaming services. That way you can get your podcast out to as many people as possible. To do this quickly in Mixcraft, we'll go into our session and right-click and add a video track. And then we'll just add some kind of image. In this case, I'll use the podcast cover artwork and drag that onto the video track. Then we can slide this out to be the length of the entire episode, and then we can export our video and distribute that on YouTube and other streaming platforms. Once you've got your video set up, you can go up to File and Mix Down To, and then you'll see some video formats here, including MP4, WMV, and AVI to export your podcast in a video format. And that wraps everything up for this episode of Mixcraft Quick Tips. I hope you found the video helpful. Be sure to subscribe and leave a like down below, and as always, thanks for watching.